Was being the entertainment business something that you always wanted to be a part of?
Yeah, I would say entertainment, yes. Did I know when I was younger that I was going to ultimately be doing TV particularly? No, but I knew that I was going to do something in entertainment. I started playing instruments when I was very young, so, I'm a musician. I did some theater in school and that kind of stuff, and I think by the time I got to college, honestly, I thought that I was going to be in radio, and all I ever wanted to be was a sports play-by-play guy. I just wanted to be an announcer for sports. I had heroes like Marv Albert and Marty Glickman, and just some of the greats that have called sports, especially in the New York metropolitan area. I mean, I grew up listening to Marty Glickman do the Giants. I grew up to Marv Albert doing the Rangers and the Knicks. And in my world there was nobody better. So I went to college to become the next play-by-play guy for sports. But I always knew I would do something in entertainment. Yes.
That's awesome. So then after that, you eventually became a part of MTV Networks. That was like a dream come true for you, must have been.
Well, yeah, except when I started with MTV, nobody really knew what it was going to be. You have to
Hmm.
remember that. I mean, I was working, I went to a SUNY school. I'm a graduate of SUNY Brockport, and I was working at an independent station in Rochester. And someone in my family got a phone call from someone who was working for this company, which is no longer in existence, that they were going to start this channel with like some music on television. And, Scott's in television, so maybe he wanted to apply, which I did. Now, at the time, there was no MTV networks, and Viacom was not the Viacom that you know of it today. Mr. Redstone had not purchased it yet. They were not a part of the picture in 1980 and 1981. It was actually a joint venture between Warner Communications and American Express, and it was called Warner Amex Satellite Entertainment Company, or WASAC was the initials, and they were basically a programming service. Now, Nickelodeon is actually older than MTV. A lot of people don't realize that. But Nickelodeon was actually a programming service through WASAC before they started MTV, and they had a lot of acquired programming, like a show that was called Live Wire and some other acquired programming that they had. And then they decided in 1981 they were going to launch this music on television type of basic cable channel. But when I started with them, I mean, I think I interviewed first probably November, December of 1980, then was called back to New York right after the first of the year in 81, and I was given the job, and then I started on June 1st of 1981, but we didn't even launch MTV until August 1st of 1981. So I've been with MTV for 2 months longer than MTV has actually been on the air. And then eventually it went through a number of iterations. MTV Networks became a publicly traded company for a while.
Hmm.
It was MTV Networks, Inc. And then I believe it was I want to say 1986, but don't quote me. That was when Mr. Redstone, who had already purchased Viacom, purchased MTV Networks. So MTV Networks was no longer a publicly traded company. It was now Viacom, was the parent company. And I stayed on with MTV until 1990, which is when we opened up Nick Studios, and I transferred divisions because MTV and Nickelodeon have both been owned by the same parent company forever. And I transferred divisions and transferred to Nickelodeon in 1990 and moved down to help them open studios.
Awesome. And what was your first impression of Nick Studios when you got there, actually?
Oh, it was beautiful. The sound stages were larger than anything that we had done in New York. And, again, I was running the studios for MTV in New York when I left. I was actually director of studio operations. We started MTV at a studio called Teletronics, which is now Unitel. It was on 10th and 33rd. And it was, oh gosh, I want to say maybe 3,000 square feet, 4,000 square feet at most. It was relatively small. Then we moved uptown to Unitel, 57th and 10th, right across the street from the CBS Broadcast Center. That's still there now. And that studio was, I want to say that studio was probably about 7,000 square feet when we first started. And we used it for a couple of years. We had a huge set on it. And then we went more to like electronic background stuff. We weren't utilizing all the studios, so we worked with Unitel. They cut it in half. They built us a second control room. So again, we went down now to about 3,000 to 3,500 square feet. We did a lot of work at National Studios, which unfortunately closed a number of years ago. They were on 10th and 42nd Street. MTV did a lot of work there. I directed a talk show out of there called Mouth to Mouth. We did some New Year's Eve specials out of there. That that studio was only 2,200 square feet, so that was very, very small. We moved into Nickelodeon Studios, and we had 2 sound stages, and each one was 16,500 square feet. So, to come into a soundstage with that much space was huge, and all the equipment and stuff was brand new. So for a TV production guy, I mean, it was a beautiful playground now that you had to work with.
Wow, that's awesome because we suspect that was going to be the studio where everything located at. But what you said now, there was basically more and more studios that you guys wanted to use for production, live production there.
Let me clarify. The first set of studios that I gave you was the MTV studios. Like, that's where we used to tape the VJ segments. So
Hmm.
again, you asked me what my impression was coming to Nickelodeon. The sound stages that I had been working in for the previous 10 years all ranged from 2,000 square feet to 7,000 square feet, and now I was walking into 2 sound stages, each one of which were over 16,000 square feet. So it became cavernous in terms of the kinds of space that we were looking at. The stages were large. They
Hmm.
were 60,000 square feet. It's like 32 feet to the steel. They were very large sound stages, and they were certainly going to be able to house what Nickelodeon had done. Now, to that point, Nickelodeon did not have their own sound stages.
Hmm.
If you've talked to any of the, and I know that you sent a list of people over to Nicole about the folks that you spoke to, people like Jerry Laybourne, Jeffrey Darby, and Scott Davis are really the 3 people who are most responsible for bringing Nick Studios to life. And if they're not on your list of past, present, and future, they really should be, because they were indeed. I mean, Jerry Laybourne was president of Nickelodeon when we opened the studios, and for a number of years prior to that, wonderfully brilliant woman with such a passion for children's television. Jeffrey Darby, who brought the production aspect to it, and then Scott Davis, who ran engineering and technical operations for MTV Networks and oversaw the construction of Nickelodeon Studios. But prior to 1990, when we opened, again, I told you Nickelodeon's older than MTV. Okay? They
Hmm.
started programming through the Satellite Entertainment Company in 1979, 1980, so they're about a year or 2 older than MTV. Well, for the first bunch of years, it was really mostly acquired programming, and they call it the green vegetable network at that point. It was good for you, but it didn't taste very good. And then there was a show that they did co-production with a with a production company out of Ottawa, Canada. That's where they found Jeffrey Darby. He was actually running production for that production company up in Ottawa. They developed a show called You Can't Do That on Television. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. I've heard of that.
Okay, so You Can't Do That on Television was that sort of sketch comedy show. It was a
Hmm.
troupe of cast troupe, and they were all kids except for that one gentleman, and the one gentleman played all the adult parts, right? He was the stage manager, he was
Hmm.
the cook in the diner, and he did all that. But the uniqueness of that show was when anyone said, "I don't know," they
They
got
get
hit with
slime.
this green substance, which became known as green slime. Well, after that show had been produced and it was on the Nickelodeon network for a while, Jerry Laybourne, again, president of Nickelodeon at the time, convinced Jeffrey Darby that he should leave Canada and come down to New York and help her run the production for Nickelodeon. And Jeffrey is one of the people that developed and created the show called Double Dare. So in 1985, 1986 now is what you're looking at. Nickelodeon launches Double Dare. And the
Right.
whole idea is that you were allowed to be messy. And that was the us versus them positioning, right? Like, kids were empowered. Kids were allowed to be messy. It was okay. All those things that kids had already been told for years and years they couldn't do, Nickelodeon was going to let them do. And from 1986, Nickelodeon produced a number of shows, Double Dare, Finders Keepers, and those types of shows. When they would do it, there was a large studio in Philadelphia. I want to say WYSP, but you could probably do the research. I'm not sure that's exactly the station, but they would literally just get on the train from New York and go down to Philly, and they would produce a whole bunch of episodes of Double Dare or Super Sloppy Double Dare or Finders Keepers, and then they'd all go back to New York and create more shows, and those shows would be on the air. It wasn't until 1988, 1989 that Universal got together with Nickelodeon, because Universal was now going to open a theme park to try to rival Disney, and their sort of theme of their theme park was obviously all about movies, right? When they opened, they had Jaws and they had King Kong, They had the famous Universal movies; those were the rides. They really had nothing on their lot that was going to be for kids and family. So Universal approached Nickelodeon and said, "Hey, you're looking for a home, right? The brand is growing. There's really no place that kids could touch, feel, and smell and taste Nickelodeon. We're
Mm-hmm.
looking for a kids and family brand to open our theme park. What if we build you sound stages? You guys equip it. You put the equipment in that you want. We'll build you the sound stages. And the only thing we ask is that while you're making television, we allow our Universal Park guests to go through and have that experience of watching Nickelodeon tape Nickelodeon shows." And that's how that partnership came to be.
I see. I see. Now, an opening day celebration. Do you remember any celebrities that were there visiting Nickelodeon?
You know what? The only thing I remember about the opening day celebration was I actually directed the 3 hour live opening party for Nickelodeon. Steven Spielberg was a big part of Universal.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe
Yes.
Steven, and that was officially the day the park was going to open. And so they opened the park, and Mr. Spielberg was down there, and we slimed him. He actually got slimed.
Yeah, that was really funny. I kind of saw that in like one of the previews. I wish the whole opening day celebration was live on the internet or something. But it was really cool to have Nick in Florida because I personally feel like it was a family friendly environment and it was kind of different from the atmosphere versus like New York or Los Angeles and stuff. I think it really worked for those early years, especially with the whole Hollywood East thing that was going on at the time.
Right, right.
But speaking of the studio, was there a particular show there that you loved visiting the set of?
Um, I mean, they were all fun. I mean, at the beginning, I directed a lot of programming for them. I went down not to run the studios, but I went down really just as a staff director to direct a lot of the programming. And so I did direct some stuff. I did the opening day party. We used to do this show called Out of Here.
Yeah,
Outea
I know what that is.
Here, right? Out of Here. So it was like a live show every day that originated from Nickelodeon Studios. I directed the first season of Welcome Freshmen. And then what started to happen was Nickelodeon started to have me help produce more programming. I don't know if you remember a show called Nick Arcade.
Oh yes, I do remember that. Hmm.
All right, so Nick Arcade was a show that the creators brought to them, and I think I saw them. They might have been on your list of people you spoke to: James Bethea and Karim Matef.
Yeah, I
And I
spoke it
think
to
I saw
Corinne.
Karim. Okay, so James Bethea and Karim Matef brought this show to Nickelodeon called Nickelodeon Arcade. I mean, for its time, it was way ahead of its time. I mean, these guys did stuff with computers way before computers were a big part of what we do now in terms of CGI technologies and animation. These guys were really, really brilliant. And I think that they tried one or two pilot attempts, and it really didn't work. And Brown Johnson, who at the time was head of production, who I worked for at the time, said, "Hey, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to work with these guys for me, from a producer standpoint. They're wonderfully creative. They're brilliant when it comes to technology. They really need like a TV producer sort of help them bring it home." And so I ended up being supervising producer and eventually exec in charge of production on Nick Arcade. And from there, I really started to take on that type of role. I really did. I stopped directing programming and really started to produce and exec programming from that point on. I am actually one of the creators of Nickelodeon Guts. It's Albie Hecht and Byron
Right.
Taylor and myself that created Nickelodeon Guts. So I was executive in charge of production when we did that show. And we did at least 3 or 4 iterations of that show before bringing it back in the early 2000s for the My Family's Got Guts
Right.
version.
Hmm.
We actually did the international version. We called it Global Guts.
Right.
We had like 96 kids from 12 countries around the world, and we produced that programming for everybody around the world. But I started doing that type of stuff and supervising programming and producing programming for Nickelodeon until 97, I guess it was, where the structure of the studio really underwent a pretty significant change, and I was made general manager of the studio. But at that point, the writing was sort of on the wall, and programming was there was less and less programming that was starting to get done at Nickelodeon Studios.
Yeah, there was absolutely kind of like a downhill battle from the late '90s. But going to Guts, do you mind if I ask about that? How did that show come about? Because I spoke to Byron Taylor, and it was a really interesting story about how a kid just wanted to like win titles in sports and not like everyday prizes like you guys won on Double Dare or Nick Arcade and stuff like that.
Right, right. Well, um, through research, Nickelodeon really determined that, kids really wanted some sort of sports show, which we really didn't have. At the time, what Nickelodeon had was a number of game shows. It was really right at the very beginning where they started doing things like um, Welcome Freshman and Clarissa Explains It All. I mean, this even predates the All That and Keenan and Kel and Amanda years. And, again, it was Brown Johnson who, called in Byron and I, because we were working for her at the time, and she said, look, you know what, we really need to come up with some sort of sports programming for kids that allows kids to compete on an even playing field in a sports environment. And she wanted to introduce me to a guy named Albie Hecht, and I had never met Albie before, but Albie was an independent producer. He had his own production company called Chauncey Production. He was affiliated with the Fred Allen Group, and Fred Allen was a marketing consulting group that had been around MTV networks from the very, very early days. Fred Allen was actually the marketing company that came up with I Want My MTV and that whole
Mm-hmm.
campaign. So,
Right.
Fred Seibert and Alan Goodman, two, great guys, brilliant minds, very creative guys.
Right.
They had this marketing company. The production arm of their company was Albie Hecht and this Chauncey Street Productions. So we literally Byron and I got introduced to Albie Hecht, who had pitched Brown a show that had a lot of sports fantasy elements to it. I think he had a little bit of rock and roll in there, if I'm not mistaken. His big giant thing at the end was they would climb up like a giant guitar or something like that up a mountain, which we ultimately turned into the Aggro Crag. But we sat with Albie and we literally put together this sports show. Byron and I had actually done like some animation stuff for a sports show. I forget what we called it. We called it the ultimate something. Gosh, I can't even remember what it was. And they didn't want to call it the ultimate something for fear that once you call something ultimate, how are you going to grow it and how are you going to let it go? But we actually had this big giant slime ball that, you would have to climb up and get to the top of the slime ball in order to sort of win the day, if you will. So it was really a merging of the minds. I mean, you had, Byron, who was brilliantly creative in terms of production design. He had been the guy that had done so many of the sets and games for all of the Double Dares and Legends of the Hidden Temples and all that kind of stuff. That
Yeah.
Byron is great at that. And I worked with Byron for years, and he's outstanding. Albie Hecht, of course, was a great producer in his own mind and in his own right, and loved the idea of like sports for kids. And what we ultimately grew into was we created a show which was not just a sports show for kids, but it was a sports fantasy show. And by that I mean, the very first stunt we did with kids was the bungee basketball, where they would stand up on the bridge, they were attached to a bungee cord and a harness, and they would jump down to the floor, and then they would jump back up with the help of the bungee cord, and they could slam dunk a basketball. Well, we had our baskets set at 11 feet, not 10 feet. So the whole idea and the concept was you can slam a basketball to a rim that's higher than what Michael Jordan uses. You got to remember now, this is the beginning 90s, right? So
Right.
basketball was synonymous with Michael Jordan. And that was really sort of how the game took off. And when we had done that, the animation originally, and we took that into research to see if we were even on the right track with kids, the feedback that we got, as Byron told you, was this wasn't about competing so I could win the bike. This wasn't a game show. This was a sports show. I wanted to win the day. I wanted either myself or my team, however it was structured, much in a sporting event. I just want to win the day. Well, what's the greatest sporting event that we had at the time? It was the Olympics. And so what did people get at the Olympics? They got medals. So we gave kids medals. We had gold, silver, and bronze medals. The winner, of course, got a piece at the Aggro Crag, and they would hold up that glowing rock that we had. But basically, they were competing to stand on that podium in first, second, or third place, because that was more important to kids in that type of environment than winning a bike or a trip to space camp
Mm-hmm.
that they might win in a regular game show.
Absolutely. And it was an awesome show, I must say. I mean, that's really a good thing that you guys did for kids at that time. And Michael Malley and Maura, they were all great hosts and referees.
Mike O'Malley, yeah, O'Malley's great. O'Malley's still a friend of mine. We did a lot of stuff together. In addition to Guts, he was also the host of Get the Picture.
Yeah,
We
he
did one
was.
run, right? And so we did one run. I directed 75 episodes of Get the Picture in the course of a month.
Oh, of course, in my mom. Wow. Yeah.
In the course of a month. Well, yeah, because game shows like that, you can do 4 a day, 5 a
hmm
day if you have to. Guts, we were actually able to do 3 a day, believe it or not.
Oh, I see. I see what you're saying because they're both fast paced, but Guts was like on a whole new level. So
Guts needed so much time to allow each of the athletes to test the particular stunt. So for example, if we were going to do the water stunt and we were doing 3 episodes in a day and each episode had 3 kids in it, you had 9 kids that you strapped to the surfboard, got a chance to go back and forth, get out, dry off, go back to their dressing rooms, and you'd rotate them. So between the taping of each stunt that you would do 3 times, you also now needed to build in rehearsal time so that the kids had some opportunity to try out the game. I mean, the object was not to set up the kids to fail. We wanted them to know what it felt like to jump off that bridge with the bungee and slam dunk the basketball. Now, some kids did it better than other kids, but everybody had the same amount of time to at least practice it a couple of times because you wanted kids to succeed. You didn't want one kid to get 13 baskets and one kid to get none. You wanted 17, 15, and 13 because you wanted it to be a competitive kind of a show. If it's a blowout, it's no fun for the participants, and it's really no fun for the people that are watching.
Right, right. Yeah, but the studio, one of the highlights being there was the tour where the guests could like watch you guys from up above, and of course the live audience. What was the best part about having that, do you think?
I mean, you know what? It was good when we were in production. I mean, ultimately, we didn't do as many production days, so we sort of needed to alter it, and we did like some pseudo productions just to keep the people interested. I think when the studios first opened, the concept was that it was going to be game show driven.
Mm-hmm.
Because at that point, that was what Nickelodeon's, substantive programming was. Now, when you do a game show, when you're in production with a game show, once you start that game show, you're pretty much in production 4 or 5 days a week. As I said, you could do, Double Dare, we used to do 4 in a day. Guts, we did 3 in a day. Legends of the Hidden Temple, we would do 4 in a day. And you would do those for 5 days a week because your game show runs are usually significantly longer. You'll do 40 to 65 in a run. When you start moving into the sitcom or sketch comedy, you're not in production as many days because what happens is Monday becomes, if you're doing a sitcom, Monday's a table read, Tuesday, Wednesday's blocking, Thursday, Friday's block, shoot, block, shoot, block, shoot, block, shoot, and at the end of that week, you net 1 episode. So the observation of the production process, very different watching game shows being done as opposed to watching a production that might be in a sitcom mode because you look down on the stage, it doesn't really appear that many people are doing anything. So we developed a thing called Game Lab, and we used to do game labs so that people at least got to experience what game show production would be like, even though Nickelodeon really stopped doing game shows by and large shortly after we opened up the studios.
Right, right.
So having the people there, I mean, it was just, after a while, you don't really, I mean, at the very beginning, it was like, ooh, people are watching us do stuff. But after a while, probably like anything else, you're not really thinking about it. It's just sort of something that's there.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. So basically, Game Lab was created so that the guests could feel they were a part of the playing game process because, like you mentioned, the whole studio at the start of the studio was just to develop game shows. So it was created just to let the guests become a part of the Game Lab in kind of like an unusual way.
Yeah, I mean, Game Lab was sort of at the end of the tour, so you would still take the tour, the people could see the sound stages, they can see the equipment rooms and all of that, and then at the end of the tour, they would be brought into what was called Game Lab, and we would literally do a 20-minute show for people. We would play games, we'd pull kids out of the audience, we'd have competition. competitions, one kid would get slimed at the end of game labs. So, we kept true to the tradition of Nickelodeon, while in the sound stages for real, we were doing things like All That and Keenan and Kel and Clarissa and, shows like that.
I see, I see. Now, this is going to be a popular question, but I think every person involved with Nick has to experience the green slime on them. But did you ever get slimed at one point?
No, I've
Oh,
never been slimed.
never been slimed? But you.
No, I've slimed hundreds. I have slimed hundreds of people. I have been responsible for hundreds of people being slimed. I have never been slimed myself.
Oh, wow. That's awesome, I guess. But
I don't know. I've never been slimed. My kids were slimed when they were little, but slimed. But me personally, no, I had never been slimed.
Okay. Now, I think one of the benefits about working there was the theme park, of course, and Universal Studios and all those great rides, the attractions, the movie based at the time, the whole entertainment based thing. But did you have a favorite ride there at Universal?
Um, Yeah, I mean, at the beginning, when we were there at the very beginning, and the Universal theme park wasn't really that crowded, and they only had one theme park. There was only Universal Studios. Like now, they have Universal, and they have Islands of Adventure, and they
Mm-hmm.
have the Harry Potter rides, and Universal's packed all the time now. I mean, there's hotels now that are on site and all that kind of stuff. But at the very beginning, when Universal was growing, the theme park wasn't always very crowded, especially in the off times of season. Like right now, we're in spring break for
Mm-hmm.
school. So as a local, you wouldn't even go near the theme parks now. But then, like in May, you can go back to the theme park. And then in June, July, and August, you stop again because the kids are all off of school. And then in September, October, it would be okay to go to the theme parks again. You just sort of learn when, and then it gets crowded at Thanksgiving and then again at Christmas. But at the very beginning, I can remember Universal not being very crowded. And, you would get to your lunch break at Nickelodeon Studios, and it was like, well, what do you want to do? I don't know. Let's go grab something to eat in the park, and we'll jump on a ride. And we would. You could go out and get something to eat. You can go on a ride, or you'd go out into the theme park and get an ice cream in the afternoon for a little bit of a break or whatever, because it was really easy access to this whole theme park that was available to you. And then, of course, as they began to grow and they got more rides and they got more popular, as a worker, I mean, I would say, my gosh, the last 8 or 9 years that I was there, I probably didn't really get into the theme park very often because you wouldn't go. I mean, it's not the kind of thing. You couldn't just jump on a ride at lunchtime and come right back home again. I mean, the lines themselves were too long. But at
Right.
the beginning, I mean, it was fun. I mean, I used to like Back to the Future. Jaws, when it worked, was a cool ride. They unfortunately had technical difficulties from the day they opened.
Mm-hmm.
Kong was a cool ride. They closed that after 9/11, though, because you could imagine. I mean, the whole ride was about the destruction of New York City. So after 9/11, that was a ride that closed. It became the Mummy. The Hanna-Barbera ride used to be fun, and then ultimately they turned the Hanna-Barbera ride into the Nickelodeon um, animation ride. So, it was the same basic flight simulator ride, but it had been augmented to, take you through Nickelodeon cartoon land with Jimmy Neutron and SpongeBob and all that kind of stuff. And now they've converted that ride yet again, but I don't remember what it was.
It is now the Despicable Me Minion Mayhem. That's what it is now.
Oh, there you go. That's right. It's the Despicable Me Minion ride. Okay, well, there you go.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of fun stuff that we would do.
Right. I mean, Jaws, that ride, that's my favorite old school ride, I must say. The shark really terrified me as a child, but
Right.
it was yeah. But I have yet to experience the Harry Potter world. Now that you mentioned it, I would love to go back there
Well,
and
neither have I. So I can't tell you if you're missing anything or not. I really don't go to theme parks. I've lived here for 20-something years. I just don't really go to theme parks anymore. It's just not my thing.
oh, okay. Now, back then, I want to talk about Orlando and Florida at the time. There was a lot of talk in the beginning about it becoming the next Hollywood East, but it kind of fizzled over the years. From your years living there, how great was it to have all the TV and film production going on, and why you think it has since decreased?
Well, that was the problem. There was never that much film and television going on. So
Um,
although when they open, I mean, look, I have my own opinions about it. I was here sort of at the beginning of when they were going to try to build this into the next sort of mecca of TV and film. And I think unfortunately they did a couple things they not the right way, and that ultimately caused its own demise. sort of missed the boat from a governmental incentive standpoint. I think if you're going to try to open something outside of Hollywood, I don't know that you could really start by saying, we are the Hollywood East and this is where everybody's going to make their movies from now on, because the reality is, and we saw it with Nickelodeon, I mean, it was one of the larger reasons that Nickelodeon ultimately closed. Conceptually, having your own internal production facility that you can do all of your own internal production is definitely a more economic model than, going to third-party vendors and doing things outside of that. Unfortunately, the creative community by which Nickelodeon was drawing its talent, and when I say talent, I mean from the producer-director side as well as from the in front of the camera side, by and large, that talent base really does live in Southern California. So when we started doing all that, and we did it with Brian Robbins and Mike Tolan and their group, again, great guys, wonderfully creative guys, that gave Nickelodeon some great years of programming, but they lived in Southern California. When they would come to Nickelodeon Studios to do, a Kenan and Kel or an All That, they would do 13 episodes over the course of 20 weeks, which means they were here for 3 or 4 weeks, then they'd go back for a week or two and rewrite stuff, and then they'd come back and they would tape for another 3 or 4 or 5 weeks at a time, which means you're away from your family for those blocks of time.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody really wants to necessarily be away from home and be away from their families for that period of time. And so what ultimately happened is that as Nickelodeon wanted more Kenan and Kel's and All That's and Amanda's and all of the other, shows that were born out of that talented cast, Brian and Mike were able to say, yeah, but you know what? We don't want to do it in Universal Studios in Orlando anymore. We really want to stay home, so let's get a studio here and we'll do it. So the combination of more live action being done out in California, and in the middle 90s is when Nickelodeon really started to invest heavily in animation. Right? 94, I think maybe 95, but certainly 94 when we started doing things like Rugrats, Ren and Stimpy, and Doug, and then the next iteration, which was Real Monsters, and then Jimmy Neutron, and then, SpongeBob, and then Dora the Explorer, and. Well, we don't do animation in Nickelodeon Studios Orlando, so they opened up Nick Animation in Burbank. So now you take the combination of live action that's being done more and more in California, take animation, which is being done in California because it's closer to Asia, where a lot of your animation and colorizing is done. That sort of gives less and less to the Nickelodeon studios, which is why ultimately we, decided to, when the deal expired with Universal in 2005, there was really no reason to re-up it because we were doing live action and we were doing animation, and both those things were coming on the West Coast. But translate that to the film industry, you're not going to get Steven Spielberg and Francis Ford Coppola and, Martin Scorsese to say, well, yeah, I'm just going to pick up for the next 6 months and I'm going to move to Orlando and shoot this film when all the talent and casting is out in California and the studios they know are in California and the crews that they know are in California and that they can live at home. I think Florida would have been better off with the sound stages it built if it would have started smaller by trying to attract some other TV properties. Go get a soap opera, get a sitcom, get a game show. I mean, granted, Nickelodeon Studios, for all the years that we were here, we probably did more production in Central Florida than almost any other company or any other network over the span of time that we were here. We were sort of the only game in town for a very, very long time. Had they been able to attract sitcoms or soap operas, okay, so now you're talking about building your talent base in Central Florida, both in front of and behind the camera. At the same time, you had states starting to figure out that if they gave tax incentives to these production companies that would come and shoot in their states, that would make it economically more attractive to production companies looking to do stuff on location. Texas was out in front of us. Louisiana was out in front of us. North Carolina was out in front of us. Florida finally, at the governmental level in Tallahassee, finally said, oh, okay, we understand that we need to do incentives for production companies. We'll put a finite amount of money in the budget to give those tax incentives to these production companies, not realizing that, maybe they set aside $3 million in the first year. Do you know how fast $3 million in tax incentives is going to go if you attract any production at all? So now if I'm the fourth guy in line, by the time I submit my application to the state of Florida because I want to use Florida crews and use Florida locations and take advantage of the incentives and the tax breaks and all that I'm going to get from the government, I'm too late. The allocation that the state government has given of $3 million, that's already gone. It's already been split up by the first 3 or 4 production companies that got in ahead of me. So now I no longer have incentive. Rather than some states that say, we will continue to give incentives as long as production keeps coming here, because as long as production keeps coming here, economically, we're stimulating our economy and we're making more money across the board as a state. They're using our hotels. They're using our rental cars. They're utilizing our restaurants. They're utilizing our entertainment. So the state as a whole is benefiting by a production coming in and doing this kind of work in this state, that those states will continue to fund those incentives instead of having a finite thing. So I just think personally, I think Florida bit off more than it could chew in 1989 and 1990 when they said, oh, we're going to be Hollywood East because of a film. They shot Parenthood here with Ron Howard.
Right.
That was in 1988, 1989.
Mm-hmm.
That was Universal's claim to fame for the longest time. We shot Parenthood here. That was one movie. One guy came, shot one movie, and then everybody went back home again.
Mm-hmm.
There was never the understanding or the desire that maybe if we walk before we run, maybe if we build the talent base both in front of and behind the camera with smaller projects, let's go get a brand new soap opera that's looking to start up and give them the economic benefit that they want to get, that maybe they will work here and shoot here 8 or 9 or 10 months out of the year, okay? And then we can start to build the base. So when a Martin Scorsese is going to look around ultimately and say, where am I going to do my next film? Well, wow, boy, Florida is less expensive, but look at all the stuff that those crews have done. Maybe they've actually got some talented people there. Maybe I should check out that state. They never did that. They went right to the finish line and said, hey, we're going to start making movies. But they never did anything to attract or build the talent base here, so it just stayed in California. It wasn't about the talent and the crews that were at Nickelodeon Studios. I tell you, if you ever got the opportunity to talk to Brian Robbins or any of the other people that worked for a long time at Nick Studios, they will tell you, we had amazingly talented people here, and we had great facilities that were impeccably maintained. Mm-hmm. Our equipment always worked. We had people that were on top of the logistics and the operations of running a studio, that producers used to say to me all the time, I wish your studio was in my hometown because I would love to shoot there all the time.
Wow.
It was strictly geography for us.
That was going to be one of my next questions, because back in the late 90s when Figure Out was the only thing taping there, and then in the early 2000s when 4 new shows were being produced at the studio, but 3 of them got canceled and one lasted for like 3 years, and then Splat was in '04 and that ended, and then the studio eventually closed in '05. Was there a bit of a difference between your years being the general manager there? Did you see a decline kind of in the studio?
Well, I mean, honestly, the writing was on the wall, like I said, to really invest heavily in animation. Once they opened Nick on Sunset, which, that's where they started to do all these other shows, the writing was on the wall for us on what was going to happen with Nickelodeon Studios, but yet we still had an obligation to do something through the end of the deal term, which was in '05. So in 1997, that's when Scott Davis left. Okay, there was a changeover in administration. I became general manager of the studio at that point, and we were finishing up, whatever programming we had. Then in like 1999, 2000, they were actually thinking of closing the studio, and we pretty much had to let everyone who was working there know that we weren't going to be operating Nick Studios the way that we were in the past. We dismantled the scene shop. Right? We had to let go of a number of people. We no longer had a scene shop. We no longer kept a warehouse. We really started to ramp it down to the point that literally we were going to close our doors. And then they called up and they said, hey, before you guys turn out the lights, we're thinking about doing this live show that would wrap around SpongeBob cartoons in the afternoon. We're going to call it Slime Time. We were like, fine. So we did Slime Time. And then Slime Time lasted for a number of years. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately Splat, and you're right, in '05 the deal ended. In the meantime, what I had done as general manager was I met with my counterpart at the time, who was the head of the Universal production group, because they owned all of the other sound stages, and they technically owned the building structure that we were in. We owned all the equipment inside. We had all the TV stuff that we put in. Universal owned the physical structure, the four walls. As part of our deal, we could not go out and sell the use of our soundstage to third-party productions. Universal, at the time, really didn't have any sound stages that had video equipment in it. They were basically four walls that were used for film. So I went to my counterpart at Universal, sat down, and I said, look, let's do this. I have video equipment. You have stages, but you have no video equipment. Why don't you sell our sound stages to third-party companies, and we'll split the revenue? So we did. So between 1998, 99, when our studio stuff started to go way, way down, and 2005, which was sort of like the finish line that we needed to get to, we basically housed third-party productions. We did stuff for Animal Planet. We had some Golf Channel stuff in there. We did a lot of stuff for a lot of people, and basically I would split the revenue with Universal. So we were running Nickelodeon Studios at a net loss. In other words, it really wasn't costing New York anything to keep the studios running because the revenue we would make from third parties was offsetting the cost of the studio. In 2005, when the deal was going to end in December of 2005, I went to New York in the early part of the year, and I met with Seema Zargami, who's the president of Nickelodeon, and Albie Hecht, and I said, do you guys want to keep it open for another year or two? Mm-hmm. After that, you would really have to do a capital investment because you'd want to upgrade your equipment, which I know Viacom didn't want to do. Right? They didn't want to invest in a place that was ultimately going to close down. We could have probably gotten another year or two out of the equipment. I said, do you want to keep it open or do you want to close it? And they said, okay, let's close it. So again, I made a deal with Universal that instead of waiting till December, we would vacate as of July 1st, and we would walk away, and we would sell them the equipment inside. Because if I wasn't going to sell the equipment, it would have taken us probably about 6 months and a lot of money, talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, to get rid of all of that equipment between wholesalers and auctions that would have taken place, getting rid of all the cabling that was done in the building, getting rid of all of that gear was at least a 6-month exit strategy. By selling the equipment back to Universal, MTV Networks basically got to walk away free and clear. They got some money for the equipment that we had, and Universal to this day owns, operates, and maintains that soundstage and the equipment that's in it. Now, they did take one of the Nickelodeon sound stages and convert that into the Blue Man Group, so that's not really a TV station studio, anymore. Mm-hmm. But the other TV studio, the other sound stage, and the TV equipment still exists in that building.
I see what you're saying. All right. Now, all your years working at Nickelodeon eventually led you to working in Spike TV right now, which is my favorite network, one of my favorite net channels right now. Your years, it's been on air for 10 years now. What are your aspirations for the network? Like, what do you really hope to accomplish for it one day? Do you like? I really like 1,000 Ways to Die. That's my favorite show.
Yeah, they're not making that one anymore. You know what? My role at Nick really, at Spike, it's changed somewhat over the years. I really am, in many ways, like the live guy. I do mostly live sports now for the network. And Nicole can tell you, I did UFC. For all the years that UFC was on Spike, I was the executive in charge of production for that. When UFC and Spike's deal ended and UFC went to Fox, Viacom purchased Bellator MMA, which is another mixed martial arts promotion. I was given that show. I'm the executive producer of Bellator MMA. We're on the road 25 weeks with that show, doing live fights every Friday night in a different city. I manage TNA Impact Wrestling, the executive in charge of production on that show. So really my contributions are in the live sports and live sports entertainment areas for Spike. I don't really do a lot of our reality show stuff. That comes from a completely other group at Spike, and they've had wonderful success of late with, Ink Master and, Auction Hunters and Bar Rescue. The reality shows on Spike are just, knocking it out of the park, which is great. I guess my hopes and aspirations for the network would be that we continue to try to build upon our sports franchises, because I really do enjoy doing, the live sports aspect of what I do. So, I love the success of our reality shows, and I think that's such a great thing for our network to continue to be able to offer guys, sort of alternative sports, because We don't do baseball, basketball, football kind of sports. We do, mixed martial arts. We do kickboxing. We do, those types of alternative sports. And I would hope that we can continue to build those franchises and offer guys and people that like those kinds of sports a place that they can come to.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned it's kind of like grown up guts now. Now that you mentioned it, you know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I used to put kids on bungee cords and slime them when they were done, and now I watch guys punch each other in the face.
Exactly, exactly. It's hilarious. Now, it's been gone for 9 years, Nick Studios. It's certainly loved by a lot of people. Would you like to see it be reopened one day? Do you think it should come back?
I think it would be really hard. I don't know that you'd ever recreate that first experience of Nickelodeon
Oh
Studios
no.
in Orlando, which, like I said at the very beginning, the thing that was special about Nickelodeon Studios was it was really the first place that kids who loved that brand and loved that network were able to actually come and see and feel and touch and smell and taste Nickelodeon. And that was really special to be a part of something that great and to watch the kids that would come through there every single day and their wonderment about just being in the middle of the Nickelodeon world. I don't know that you ever recreate that in a soundstage environment,
Oh
but I know
no.
that Nickelodeon over the years has moved into more of the recreational front, so kids can go to certain theme parks now and experience that Nickelodeon, so they can continue to touch and see and feel and be a part of Nickelodeon in much more of a recreational theme park way than in watching a TV show necessarily be taped. So I don't know. I would say no. I don't know that I want to see Nickelodeon Studios Orlando open again. I think it was a great memory, and I'd sort of like to remember it exactly the way that it was. It was a very tight knit group. There were people that came from all over to work here at that place. It was a place that you sort of felt like this was your family because New York and LA and all those places were, they were where they were. You were at this place almost like all by yourself. And not that it was us against the world, but you almost felt like you needed to be that much better than the sound stages in New York or the sound stages in LA to make people want to come to you. And I think that we accomplished that. Like I said, if you had the opportunity to talk to any of the producers that came through there that got the opportunity to make their shows at Nickelodeon Studio, they might tell you geographically it was a really tough challenge. But from an experience standpoint, I would say to a person, every producer would tell you that their experience at Nickelodeon Studios was a great one. And I think in that regard, I think we accomplished what our goals were every year.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everyone I talked to said it was one of the best jobs they ever had. I think the people there, they were just magnificent people. All the shows there that are still loved today and that were filmed there, it's really become a great and special place. And that's why I created a project, just to hear your stories. But
I
Scott,
hope you
thank
got enough information out of me.
yeah, right, right. But Scott, it was really a pleasure talking to you today, I must say. I thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome. I mean, I look forward to whatever it is that this thing becomes in its final form, and I hope I get to see it or watch it or hear it or do whatever, and good luck with the rest of your project. If you need anything else, feel free to email me, and I'll try to answer whatever other questions you have.
Oh, okay, definitely, definitely. And I'll send you the link to the interview once it's done. I'll show it to you by tomorrow, actually.
Okay.
All right, cool. All right, have a nice day, Scott.
All right. Thanks very much, Bilal.
All
Bye.
right,